As we covered in last week's vocabulary, Cold warfare is when two countries are hostile towards each other, but do not actually physically fight. In history, the Cold War is the decades-long tension or hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, also known as Russia. For this reason, it is seen as a debate between democracy and communism. The two sides are the United States, which represents democratic government, and the Soviet Union, which has a communist government. These two countries are basically polar opposites in everything. The United States is capitalist as far as its economy goes, which means that they have private ownership of businesses and people are able to run their businesses themselves. On the other hand, the Soviet Union is socialist in their economy, which means that they have all of the businesses controlled by the state. Them. In the United States, there's also religious freedom and freedom of speech, whereas in the Soviet Union, this expression is not allowed. In fact, in the Soviet Union, if an expression was voiced that was against what the state or government wanted, these people could be imprisoned or even killed. That should make a lot of sense to you because Stalin was still in charge of the Soviet Union when all of this began. And as you know, he has a record of doing that quite often. Finally, in the United States, going along with their democratic and capitalist ideas, they allow private property, which means you can own a house, you can own a car, etc. In the Soviet Union, there's only public property. That means no individual person owns anything. It is all owned in common. So how did the Cold War begin? Sadly, it began the very moment that World War II ended. When World War II ended in 1945, conference in Potsdam, Germany. For this reason, it's called the Potsdam Conference. In it, all the allies, those who had been on the winning side of the war, got together as leaders and spoke about what to do next. Stalin was there representing Russia, who had fought with the United States, Great Britain, and France to defeat Hitler. At that point, though, Stalin made an announcement that shocked the other countries. He said that he would not allow the satellite states that he had conquered to have free elections. The satellite states were the states that he had personally had his army free from Hitler's rule. These are the states that were on the eastern side of Europe, because that's the side that Stalin was attacking from, obviously. They include places like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. So basically what he was saying was he wouldn't let them choose their own government. Instead, he was going to put one in. This, of course, made the other allies feel very uneasy, especially since Stalin was the only ally who had a communist government. Truman, which was our president, was not the only one who was upset about this. In fact, Churchill, who you will remember was Great Britain's prime minister, was very upset as well and made a speech, which, as you learned in our World War II unit, was basically what he always did. In his speech, he said an iron curtain had descended across Europe, splitting them in half. What he meant by that is pretty clear when you look at a map. In red, which is the color of communism, you see all of the satellite states that the Soviet Union, aka Stalin, had taken over afterwards because they had, quote unquote, helped free them from Hitler, so they had a right to help them get back on their feet. However, he was making them all communist. On the left, which is the Western side, you have in blue, which is often a color associated with democracy, all the democratic countries of Europe. So the Iron Curtain that Churchill's talking about is just the line between them. It's not a real line, there's no line there, there's no wall even. But it's the idea that if you look on a map, there's almost an iron curtain, a barrier between the democracies and the communisms of Europe. Now, how was America doing? At this point, our president was Truman. He had become president when FDR died right at the end of World War II. He started out with his main policy, which was very creatively named the Truman Doctrine. And this came about just 2 years after the tension began in 1947. What happened is that Greece and Turkey, which are countries in Europe, were being threatened with communism. They were having some invasions and people trying to overthrow their governments. They asked for help, and Truman wanted to help them. He went to Congress and said that America should commit to help nations who were struggling against communism. In other words, if a nation was being threatened by a communist invasion, America should step in. He said if we try to stay isolated like we did in World War II, we were going to have big problems. Congress listened. Very soon, they allowed $400 million to be sent to Greece and Turkey. That was very effective for them. Containment then became the next big idea for Truman. Containment just means keeping things within certain borders. George Kennan, who was an American advisor to Russia at the time, so he knew a lot about the country, was the one who gave Truman the idea. He told Truman that though Stalin wanted to spread communism, he would not risk the security of the Soviet Union for it. In other words, even though Stalin really wanted communism to spread, he wasn't willing to put his country at actual risk. Therefore, Truman said, officially, the United States had a policy of containment. In other words, they were telling other countries in the world, if you're communist, you need to keep it in your borders. Don't try to spread it. The next policy under Truman was known as the Marshall Plan. It was named after his Secretary of State, George Marshall, who suggested it. Basically, he asked for $13 billion for Western Europe to help them recover from World War II and rebuild their economies. This should seem like a huge amount, and you might wonder why he had the guts to ask for it and why Congress allowed it. But the thing to remember is actually Hitler. Marshall argued that the reason that World War II had happened was because of the consequences of World War I, when Europe, and especially Germany, had been left in economic ruin and no one had helped them. He argued that unless Europe was given the money they needed to rebuild, they would likely become communists too, because at that point, communists were offering food and provision for everyone. Not that they were actually delivering, but just that people could get desperate, and they had seen it happen before. Because of this, this cartoon captures how people felt about the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. As you can see, Truman is pictured sprinkling money all over Western Europe, and that being kind of a barrier to the virus of communism. The idea was, if we keep everyone well supplied, they won't feel like they need to run to anything else. Interestingly, part of the Marshall Plan actually offered money to the eastern satellite states of Russia, but Stalin would not allow them to accept it. At this point, you should be getting a pretty good picture of each of the leaders of these countries. Truman is going to fight issues mostly economically, which is going to be different from the next president of the United States, Eisenhower, who's going to use weapons. On the other hand, Stalin is going to use political control. He's not going to allow people to make their own political decisions, and that's how he's going to keep them under his control. This was also shown very clearly in the first major occurrence of the Cold War between the United States and Russia. It was called the Berlin Blockade, and it occurred in 1948. To understand the reasons behind this blockade, you have to see a map first. After World War II, Germany itself had been split into 4 parts between the 4 allies that had conquered it. Each ally was in charge of a section, which you can see colored on the map. The United States, France, and Great Britain had Western Germany, while Russia had the eastern section of Germany. However, Berlin, which is the capital city of Germany, was in Russia's section. So they also divided, as you can see by the little colors here, that capital city into 4 miniature zones. Each country was in charge of helping that section of Germany get back on its feet, but also in charge of making sure that they had political structures that would never allow something like World War II and the Nazis' rise to happen again. However, after the Marshall Plan and the policy of containment being announced by the United States, the Soviets, remember that's Russia, were upset at the United States. And as a way to get revenge, they blockaded or closed off all of Berlin. In other words, even though they had agreed that the United States, France, and England could all come into Berlin and operate in there, they actually closed the city and locked them out. The way that the United States and Great Britain responded was the Berlin airlift. For almost an entire year, they literally flew in all the supplies to their citizens that were there, that were needed, and dropped them from the sky in parachuted packages. Think food, clothes, even children's toys. This massive, again, economic strategy, which is right up Truman's alley, use money in order to send a message, finally wore Stalin down. And in the next year of 1948, he surrendered and opened up the Berlin sections again. It was after this that the group called NATO was created. It stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was a group of 12 Western nations that agreed that they would act together to defend Western Europe if communism tried to encroach or enter it. Kind of as retaliation, Russia got together with their 7 satellite states, not that they had much of a say, and made the Warsaw Pact, which promised the same thing, but about democracy. So at this point in the Cold War, even though again it's still cold, no one is actually fighting, they're just moving money and people around, they have declared sides. You have 12 Western nations against 8 Eastern nations in Europe. And they are saying democracy versus communism, we've picked a side. The arms race continues to happen at this time. Arms is another word for weapons. Now at this time, the United States believed they had the upper hand. After all, they had been the first to develop nuclear power, with the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima that ended World War II. No one else had ever seen anything like it, so we thought we were far ahead of the game. However, by 1949, we detected radiation coming from Russia, and we realized that they had also developed a nuclear bomb. This led President Truman to authorize a hydrogen bomb to be created. A hydrogen bomb is supposed to have 1,000 times the power of a nuclear bomb. For example, though a nuclear bomb might kill people within a 1-mile radius, a hydrogen bomb would kill everyone within a 10-mile radius. When the hydrogen bomb created by the United States was tested on an uninhabited island in the Pacific in 1952, the entire island was disintegrated. While that sounds like we made a huge advancement, by 1953, just 1 year later, Russia also had a hydrogen bomb. This led to what's known as MAD, mutually assured destruction. It's the principle that if we continue to stockpile weapons, making more and more of the same kind that our enemies have, maybe no one will actually fire because everyone will be scared of being destroyed. As you can see in this picture, it shows how each country would have all the same types of weapons, and therefore they won't use those big weapons, at least, because they'll be worried of the results. All of this was because of the fear of what is called the domino effect. The United States was worried that if one country fell to communism, all the countries around it would soon fall to it, because it did seem to be a trend. And this turned out to be partially true. We're going to see in the next lecture how these countries right here did start falling to communism, and how America gets involved and actually experiences hot conflict, physical fighting, within the Cold War, because we fight other people who Russia's messing with instead of fighting Russia themselves.